All right. Well, I'm sure we're going to have folks continue to trickle in, but I'm gonna jump in here, kick us off. Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Leonard Barrett. Use he, him pronouns. Families for Climate, facilitating tonight with Nora Lehman. Families for Climate is currently an all-volunteer organization working to mobilize parents and kids for climate justice and global future for all. This is our third legislative preview event somehow. We really appreciate everybody making it here tonight. I know there are a bunch of folks joining who are parents who just got kids to sleep or are shushing them in the background. We appreciate you. So we're here to talk about how we in Oregon can advance critical climate and environmental justice policy in the coming months. As many of you know, the legislative session opened on January 17th, 1 week ago, and it runs through as late as June 25th. So 2023 is a long session, and we have many months ahead of us to move the needle on climate policy. Here to share with us tonight are partners from 5 organizations working on different facets of environmental, economic, and transportation justice in Oregon. They will share legislative concepts and bills that they're prioritizing this session. And I want to caveat that the bills that they'll share tonight don't represent all of the important climate and environmental justice bills at the legislature this year. But we think that this is a good overview of many of the major priorities and pretty comprehensive for what we can accomplish in an hour and a half at 8 o'clock at night. So each presenter will share bills, and then we'll open it up for a few questions after each presentation. Please feel free to drop questions into the chat as they occur to you. Nora and I will be monitoring for those, and we'll read those out. There's going to be a lot of information on a lot of bills. So this is admittedly just an introduction to give folks an overview of key priorities this session. We'll be following up in the next week, probably by the end of this week, with a recap document. So take notes, but know that we will also follow up with the high points, including some resources for further reading. And I also encourage you to watch for social media and email updates from the organizations presenting tonight, including Families for Climate, throughout session, to stay up to date on opportunities to get involved at key times during session. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Nora Apter, Climate Program Director at Oregon Environmental Council, to set the stage in terms of the mood in Salem going into the session, and then we'll get into the bills. Nora Apter, thanks for being here tonight and kicking us off.
My pleasure. Thank you all so much for hosting this event and everybody for being here. Very timely, as you noted, Leonard, with session just kicking off, and it's going to take all of us and many not in the virtual room tonight to move the needle on climate and make progress on our priorities this session. So thank you all. Just going to set the stage a little bit in terms of how this session is shaping up. And of course, as anybody who has been through a legislative session before knows, it's always a little bit unpredictable. We have to be nimble, but we do have, I think, a lot to be excited about going into this session in terms of the legislative makeup, as well as the opportunity that we have with federal funding. So, of course, we had a midterm election this past November, and what we really saw coming out of that was an emphasis that Oregonians want people in office who are committed to climate action. We have seen some folks call the election a green wave. Folks might recall Governor Tina Kotek ran on her track record of passing transformative climate policies like HB 2021, our 100% clean electricity law, and pledged to defend and build on our state's climate progress. We also saw Oregon voters pass Measure 113 that will hold politicians accountable for unexcused absences from the Capitol. Folks will remember that was a tool that anti-climate legislators have used in the past to prevent the passage of a number of key climate legislation policies, among other bills. A number of other candidates for the state legislature ran and won on a climate platform, and we were able to maintain pro-environment majorities in both the House and the Senate. So what that means is we have a really incredible opportunity this session to advance more ambitious, equitable climate policies that we know will create jobs and expand on our existing clean energy economy. Relatedly, and what's also really exciting and different going into this session is the important and incredible opportunity we have to leverage recent federal climate action and investments. Most notably, folks have probably heard about something called the Inflation Reduction Act that Congress passed back in August of last year. That law will invest roughly $370 billion just in climate and clean energy programs. So there's going to be a really big emphasis this session on how we can best position our state to leverage that funding and translate it into meaningful near-term benefits for Oregonians. I will note that while we have this really important federal investment opportunity, and you'll see that theme, I think, threaded throughout the panel presentations tonight, we are also going into a tighter budget season. Climate advocates recognize that our energy and environment agencies in the state have been historically starved of funding, and that makes our job to support strong budgets for those agencies even more important this session as we're going into some tightening of belts as it is with the budget. So that's something we'll talk about as well. I think just a couple other pieces to note. We have, again, this new administration. We also have seen from the Democratic caucuses an emphasis on addressing Oregon's housing affordability and houselessness crisis. Again, I think that definitely relates to a number of our priorities in the climate space, but just kind of noting some of the themes that we're seeing coming up, and as well as an emphasis on addressing houselessness and housing affordability. Both the House and Senate Democratic caucuses did list climate as a priority for this session. So that is a really strong signal. Again, it's going to be a whirlwind session. It already feels that way. So again, really appreciate everybody being here, and I'll turn it back to Leonard.
Thank you so much, Nora, for that context. So we're going to jump right into presenters and legislative concepts and bills. And up first, we have Ira Cuello-Martinez from PCUN. Ira, thanks so much for being here tonight and sharing.
Thanks, Leonard. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for my presentation. Awesome. So today I'm here to talk to you all about a legislative concept and policy that advocates have been working on, termed as right to refuse dangerous work. And for folks who don't know me, my name is Ira Cuello-Martinez. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director at PCUN, Oregon's Farm Worker Union, and have been working on environmental justice policy as well as worker rights policies, and really trying to connect the two different issue areas and ensure that our workers are also protected from the increasing extreme weather conditions and other issues that relate to environmental justice. So I'm going to go ahead and get started to give folks a bit of context of how this concept and policy idea came to be. One, just want to highlight how Oregon workers have been increasingly at risk of illness and death on the job due to climate hazards, but also recognizing that workers are exposed to dangerous conditions when they work with heavy machinery, toxins, and other hazards. And specifically for PCUN, we have heard from our members through surveys and as we engage with our base about their concerns working in extreme heat and wildfire smoke. And we, fortunately, in Oregon have passed the strongest and most progressive protections for workers working in extreme heat and wildfire smoke. However, there are some limitations with what Oregon OSHA can actually do, specifically to mandate work stoppages once conditions become very dangerous, as we've seen in the last couple of years with the heat waves, as well as wildfire smoke and wildfires And here are just some images to capture what has happened. In 2021, a farm worker in St. Paul passed away due to the extreme heat. His name was Sebastian Francisco Perez. So a real life example of how working in dangerous conditions due to climate change and extreme weather conditions have resulted in very tragic scenarios and moments, and also dystopian images as seen on the right here with the wildfire smoke, red orange skies, people cannot see and are still trying to harvest and work during those Labor Day fires. So just trying to really recognize how there have been an increase in extreme weather conditions and how farm workers continue to labor through these extreme weather conditions. And there's more that Oregon can do to protect them when it comes to not only these conditions, but all unsafe and hazardous conditions that they may face in the workplace. And I also like to ground ourselves by hearing directly from community members, from farm workers themselves about how they feel and what they experience working in those conditions. So here I have a quote from Nora. She says, "To better take care of the workers, they should send us home early when it is very hot. Contractors don't want to lose money. When our farm worker ally Sebastian died last year, I felt how that could happen. When I worked in the summer, I wanted to vomit. I was very dizzy because of the heat, and we worked so many hours. We need stronger laws and rules to send us home and support us from being forced to work in the heat so no more farm workers die." So this is, again, just one of many stories that we've heard from several members that PCUN engages with about how they've been impacted by extreme heat and wildfire smoke over these last few years. So going more closely into like what the actual issue is with regards to right to refuse work in Oregon. So as mentioned, workers are dying and getting severely injured due to hazardous and unsafe work conditions. And for further context, there is an existing national right to refuse work, but it's a very technical process for workers to actually exercise. They have to go through 4 different hurdles and barriers, and oftentimes it's really difficult to actually apply the right to refuse work. And in addition, if a worker does end up successfully refusing work, they could still be fired due to retaliation and the lack of retaliation protections that exist with the federal rule. And so what we're proposing is that the Oregon legislature must guarantee the right to safe work by protecting workers from retaliation if they're reasonably refusing hazardous work until that hazard is abated. So what the policy specifically does and the solution that's being proposed by advocates is that the policy would allow workers to reasonably refuse to do work that can cause them death, serious impairment, or injury, such as working in unsafe equipment. It also gives workers the right to leave or refuse to report to a work site due to extreme natural disasters, active evacuations, and acts of criminal violence, such as mass shootings. So we don't want to put the workers at risk if there are unsafe situations and cases happening around their workplace. The LC would also allow employers the opportunity to remove or fix the hazardous conditions or reassign the worker, in which case the worker would not have the right to refuse. So the employer does have an opportunity to abate the hazard or fix the hazard or provide the appropriate PPE or equipment or training to ensure that the worker understands how the hazard has been mitigated. But there are other cases such as extreme heat where we can't control the weather and farm workers aren't going to be sent inside to harvest crops because that's not how agricultural work functions. And so instead, they would be eligible to refuse work in those hazardous conditions because there is really no way to eliminate that specific hazard. The other issue is that if workers do end up refusing to work and go home early, that means that they do lose on income, and especially for farm workers who are one of the lowest paid workers in the state, every paycheck, every day of work, it plays a significant role in their financial stability. And so this policy would also allow workers to use their sick time, PTO, or vacation time to protect their pay in situations where it's too dangerous to work. And then lastly, and probably one of the most important pieces as well, is that workers are protected from retaliation under an existing and established rebuttable presumption that they can exercise this right in good faith and act as a reasonable person. So this is what the policy is proposing. We think it's a really straightforward policy to allow workers to refuse working in those dangerous and hazardous conditions. And I'll wrap up my presentation by giving folks a current status of where the policy is. So this policy is being chief sponsored by Representative Nelson, Representatives Hudson, and Senator Patterson. So if any of these elected officials are your representative or senator, we encourage you to thank them for being a chief sponsor on this very important piece of policy. We currently do not have a bill number that is pending. We are expecting the bill number to be dropped here soon within the next week or less, but it will be introduced in the House and it's going to be referred to the Business and Labor Committee. So we encourage folks to keep an eye out on the Business and Labor Committee for when this policy is dropped and a hearing will be scheduled sometime in the next month or so. So that's the overview for the right to refuse dangerous work. I'm happy to take any questions that folks may have.
Thank you so much, Ira. I don't see any in the chat right at the moment, but I see a hand up. Michael Human, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, this is maybe a giveaway, but I'm trying to, could you explain who's the opposition to this? I think it's worth knowing. Where's the opposition to this likely to come from?
We do anticipate the ag industry to have concerns and questions about the policy. And we have had a conversation with them at the start of this year and expressed some of those concerns and questions they have on it. Specifically, they are concerned about the I believe they termed it confrontations and just conflict that would arise among workers and employers being a concern. Although I think, you know, given the standard that is in the policy that the worker can refuse to work if it's something that's either going to lead to death, serious injury, or serious impairment of the health. So I think a reasonable person to see a dangerous condition at least in my opinion, should not have an issue with the worker being able to choose to go home because they don't want to die or get seriously injured because of whatever hazard is present. So that's the context that we've had with opposition up to this point, potential opposition and likely opposition. And we'll most likely hear further opposition questions and concerns once a public hearing is scheduled and we get to hear testimonies from other folks.
Thank you, Ira.
Great. With no other questions, happy to pass it on to the next presenter. And if folks do come up with a question, I'll keep an eye out for the chat.
Great. Thanks so much, Ira. Next, we have Chris Smith of the Just Crossing Alliance. Chris, thanks for being here.
Great, thank you. Let me get my slides up here. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So let me take a moment to introduce the Just Crossing Alliance. We are a group of 32 environmental justice organizations that are focused on getting the most sustainable and equitable outcomes from the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. And I'll talk about the Interstate Bridge in a minute. But what I have for you tonight are a selected set of transportation bills that all touch on climate in some way. These are not all necessarily positions of our alliance, but they're they're showing up in the spaces that we work in. So I wanted to share those with you. The one that we do have a specific position on is, of course, the funding bill for the bridge itself. I suspect a lot of you are aware that transportation is 40% of the greenhouse gases in Oregon, and it is growing. Even as we're successfully reducing greenhouse gases in other sectors, it continues to grow in transportation. So that's a major reason why we focus on this. So let's talk about the interstate bridge replacement. The first thing to know is it's not a bridge replacement. It's actually a 5-mile freeway expansion program. It includes 2 bridges, the bridge over the Columbia as well as the one over the Portland Harbor, and 7 freeway interchanges in the scope of the project. And some of you may have been around 10 years ago when this was called the Columbia River Crossing. This is essentially a recycled version of that. The project very carefully did not revisit the purpose and need statement for the project. So we're working essentially from a 2008 problem definition. I think everybody in this room would agree that we have very different understandings of both climate and equity than we did in 2008, but we are still working to solve the problem as it was perceived then. The piece of legislation that will be in front of the legislature this session is $1 billion ask. The way this project is set up, the overall cost is expected to be somewhere between $5 billion and $7.5 billion. They're asking each of the states to put in $1 billion as sort of the local share, and then they're seeking roughly another third from federal grants from both the Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Transit Administration, and then they expect to fill in the rest with tolls. And that math works as long as the project stays at $6 billion or under. If it goes over $6 billion, probably the states are on the hook for the overruns. And we have seen this project cost accelerate greatly until a couple months ago. They were using a number of 3.2 to 4.8 billion, and then they reran all their numbers to account for the recent inflation and got a very different number. And I think we can expect that it will continue to grow. So the strategy of the Just Crossing Alliance is not to oppose the project, because frankly, there is a lot of consensus around the seismic risk on the current I-5 bridge. And we think if we oppose that, we would get thrown out of the room. So we are not opposing the reconstruction of the bridge itself, but we're essentially saying, this should just be a bridge replacement. It doesn't need to include the 7 interchanges. We do, of course, very much want to see the transit component. The project includes light rail extending from the Expo Center station at the end of the current yellow line to a station on Hayden Island, and then 2 stations in Vancouver, one on the waterfront and one downtown near the Vancouver Library. So our pitch to the legislature is, hey, give them about half the money they're asking for. So let's limit the Oregon contribution to $500 billion and tell them to just focus in on the bridge and the light rail. If they want to come back and propose the other projects, the interchanges as subsequent phases, fine, we can evaluate those on their merits, and we can do that state by state. Oregon doesn't need to weigh in on the Washington interchanges, of which there are 4, and Washington doesn't need to weigh in on the really big piece, which is rebuilding the Marine Drive interchange. That's the Marine Drive interchange probably costs almost as much as the bridge itself. So we'd like to see those stripped out and hopefully never funded, but certainly not a priority. We want to take apart the bundling of the seismic priority with all these interchanges, because the interchanges had nothing to do with the seismic priority. So we will be mounting a campaign through the legislative session that will not just be directed at legislators, but also be directed at the public to change public attitudes around this. So watch for that coming from us. Getting into some other bills, and again, these are not JCA positions per se, but work that's going on in spaces that we often find ourselves in. The first is OTC reform. So the Oregon Transportation Commission is the body that governs transportation in Oregon. It currently has 5 members. The only requirement for geographic equity is that one of them be from the other side of the Cascades. And at least during Governor Brown's time, and I think for a considerable period before that, the body has been populated mainly by folks who want to see automobile infrastructure increased. So the hope of this bill is to, one, get more geographic equity. This would require that there be a member from every congressional district. So that would give us at least 5 of the 9 seats dispersed around the state. But then would also make sure that we're representing things like tribal interests, youth, people with disabilities and folks who may be relying on modes other than driving, so transit riders, for example. I think a diverse group of people like that would give you a very different set of interests than the current commission, which is focused on freeway widenings around the Portland region. So this is House Bill 2619. The chief sponsor is Rep. Pham, and I will say it's a delight to have Rep. Pham on both the Joint Transportation Committee as well as the Joint I-5 Bridge Committee, where she is asking the skeptical questions that we all had 10 years ago during the CRC, but nobody in power was willing to voice. Now they're starting to get talked about, so that's a very good thing. The next bill, HB 3014, and we're calling this the bike bus bill. I suspect a lot of you know about Coach Sam Balto and his effort to run bike buses to schools in the region, and in fact, as a case study for folks all over the country who are copying him. School districts are currently not allowed to put a dime into that work. We have provisions in the law that governs school districts that if the school buses don't run, they can give parents stipends to drive kids to school, but they can't give out a dime to let somebody organize a bike bus or other non-auto kind of transportation. So this bill would correct that aspect of state law and give school districts the flexibility to spend transportation dollars on a variety of ways to get kids to school safely in a sustainable way. So rooting for this one. Some of you may know that it's been a long-standing feature of the Oregon Constitution for probably at least 3 decades that you're only allowed to spend revenues collected from operating a motor vehicle in the right of way. So that means you can't, for example, take gas tax dollars and use them to subsidize transit. That has been put on the ballot a few times. Senator Gorsuch is going for another try. Senator Gorsuch is the Senate co-chair of the Joint Transportation Committee, and he is known to be a fan of rail in particular, but it's certainly, he's a breath of fresh air compared to Senator Beyer, who, I remember most strongly from opening up a hearing by saying, I just want to build some roads. Now, the bad news is Senator Beyer is now over on the Oregon Transportation Commission, but Senator Gorsuch is giving us another chance to look at whether we want to open up gas tax and other auto-related revenues for things that would reduce traffic burdens, not just facilitate more cars. Honestly, I don't know if this is politically the correct time to put this on the ballot. I'm sure there'll be some discussion around that, but the idea at least is out there for discussion. E-bike rebates. Those of you who are e-bike fans, as I am, I'm a 4-year e-bike owner. I know there's some e-bike owners on this call. Probably followed the federal legislation, both the IIJA or bipartisan infrastructure law, whatever name you want to use for it, that flirted with including e-bike rebates, but didn't. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, which also flirted with e-bike rebates and then didn't. So that conversation has devolved to the states. Oregon has some rebates for electric vehicles today, but none of them apply to e-bikes. The energy usage of an e-bike is several orders of magnitude smaller than the energy usage of an electric car, and electric cars are great. But for example, an electric pickup truck uses enough lithium to make 300 e-bike batteries. So just in terms of energy usage and consumption of scarce materials, e-bikes are one of the best people movers out there. They are enormously popular. In Oregon, nationally, we sold more than twice as many e-bikes in 2020 than we did electric cars. So the market is responding to them, and Rep. Graber is chief sponsor of a bill that would tell DEQ to create a rebate program, not unlike the one we have for electric cars. Happy to say that Rep. Graber got her first exposure to e-bike a couple of years ago at an event that OEC was one of the main sponsors of. I was fortunate to participate in that event, and you could see the smile on her face when she got off the e-bike. This work was actually started by Rep. Power, who, as we know, retired this past session, and Rep. Graber has picked it up. So looking forward to this one. And finally, the last bill I'm going to talk about is HB 2677 from Chief Sponsor Rep. Pham. And this is a fix it first bill. It basically says we should prioritize maintaining our roadways ahead of building new roadway capacity. And it says that if the DOT wants to build a project that adds lane miles to the system, and lane miles is sort of the way we count the total amount of roadway that we have, they have to demonstrate that they have funding to maintain the current system at a specific state of good repair. And the DOTs around the country are notorious for building new stuff, even as they complain that they have no money to maintain the stuff they already own and operate. So this would force them to demonstrate that they have the ability to maintain what they have before they get shiny new stuff. That's the last bill I have, and I'm happy to answer questions. And I'll drop out of SlideShare so we can see each other.
Chris, you talked about changing public perceptions on the bridge. Does the public have any perceptions? Do we have any idea that regular people have paid any attention to all the debates over the bridge?
Yeah, we have not done any polling. That's one of the things we're contemplating for the campaign. Yeah, depending on which part of the public you talk to, there are vastly different impressions. People on the Oregon side have different view than people on the Washington side. Even on Washington, folks in Vancouver feel differently than folks in Clark County. The fact that the project includes light rail, which is welcomed in Vancouver, but not so much outside Vancouver and Clark County. The fact that there will be tolls involved. But I think the biggest thing is just to change the perception that this is, in fact, a bridge project, when in fact it's a big freeway project, and get people to understand which elements are really the priorities. I think you're right, Steve. There's a bit of a vacuum out there, but lots of ingrained attitudes from different perspectives.
The other thing is not really a question, but a comment. I mean, probably the time will never be politically right to try to change the Constitution on the gas tax, but what the hell? Why not try? I'm glad Gorsuch has been pushing that. Can't wind up worse off.
Bill Harris, I see a hand raised, and then after Bill, I see Philip Barnhart has a hand raised as well. Bill, go ahead.
What in general are the price ranges of electric bikes, and what is the amount of the subsidy?
So yeah, a good electric bike probably starts at about $1,000, and you could easily go up to $5,000 if you get a fancy cargo bike that can carry a couple kids. There was one particular model over Christmas that was on sale for $500 that sold a huge number. I believe and I'm not remembering the full legislative text, but I want to say it caps out at $1,200 off, but it has to be for a less expensive bike, it might be a little bit less, but I think $1,200 is the maximum rebate we're talking about. So it could be half the price of a good e-bike.
It's a bigger percentage than the percentage of e-cars then.
There are probably people who know about the car rebates better than I do, so I'll decline to speculate on that one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Bill?
Yeah, a comment that sort of supports the previous comment. It would be, I used to chair the revenue committee, and I can tell you that the hoops you jump through trying to get money to do anything other than pavement is fantastic. And if there's a way of getting the highway fund broadened, as Gorsuch has proposed, we should go for it, recognizing that people like AAA and the truckers are going to oppose it, and somebody's going to have to come up with a great deal of money in order to run a campaign to pass the thing. So if you can't get the money, don't bother putting it on the ballot because it will lose badly. If you can get the money, think about it. The other issue, boy, I'm losing track of it. So I'll pass, and maybe we can get back to it later. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I've got it now. The ODOT is now considering, has a committee working on the congestion tolling. Is anybody working on a bill having to do with that issue? And if so, what's the status of that? Do we know?
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. So for those of you who haven't been following closely, ODOT has figured out that they are never going to fund all their pavement dreams with the gas tax, because the gas tax is declining both because of inflation and because of more fuel efficient cars and non-gas cars. So they're turning to tolling as their financing mechanism. And they have three projects in the works that involve tolling. The first is to toll a segment of I-205 for about 7 miles between Oregon City and Stafford Road. The larger vision is to toll pretty much all of I-5 and I-205 between the Columbia River and the Boone Bridge in Wilsonville. And then the interstate bridge, as we talked about, will have its own tolling. So there are 3 toll projects in the hopper. They're taking a lot of political heat on the I-205. Folks in Clackamas County feel like they're getting picked on, probably with some justification. And it's a weird amalgam. It's not pure congestion pricing, because in congestion pricing, what you're trying to do is basically just charge people enough to alter their behavior and smooth out the rush hour peaks, get the roadway to the point where it operates reasonably efficiently. ODOT is pushing for tolling to fund projects, and it will have time of day variation. So you'll pay a larger toll at rush hour than you will in the middle of the night. But even at 3 a.m., you're going to pay some kind of toll, because ODOT's going to bond that to pay for the widening of I-205 for the Rose Quarter project and God knows what else. So I think there is clearly a political opportunity around tolling to force better policy, but there's also political risk you get worse policy. And there are folks in Clackamas County who want to put it at the ballot and say that every county that's within 15 miles of a toll road has to vote for it and approve it before it can be implemented. That would make it hard to get true congestion pricing. And I see Alan's hand.
Thanks very
I'm
much.
actually gonna, Alan,
yeah.
I'm gonna jump in. We're gonna have some additional time for Q&A at the end. And Alan, I'm sorry to jump in, but I'm gonna keep us moving to the next presenter for the moment, noting that you and one other person in the chat have something additional, although it sounds like we may lose Chris early. But Chris, maybe, if you want to drop contact information in the chat.
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you.
We can advance it that way. Sorry to be abrupt. I'm going to call up Brad Reed from the newly formed Building Resilience Coalition to talk about clean buildings policy at the 2023 session, and hopefully a little bit about that coalition as well. Thanks for being here, Brad.
Thank you. Great to be here. Great to see all these wonderful friends. Many folks who have been doing this a long time with us. I'm happy to be in my new role as the campaign director for Building Resilience. Leonard mentioned brand new coalition just coming together to work on homes and buildings in Oregon, the legislature. And I use he, him pronouns. Just a quick bit about Building Resilience. It was originally formed by a steering committee of 6 groups. And love all these folks: OLCV, Unite Oregon, OJCA, Oregon Environmental Council, Climate Solutions, and Community Energy Project. And our coalition is quickly growing. Families for Climate is one of our newest partners. As well as I see many of you your organizations have joined as well. If you are part of an organization, you haven't got an invite, we're having a kickoff on Friday for the coalition. Go ahead and get in touch with us, and we're happy to invite you to that to find out a little bit more. I'm extremely excited to be working on the homes and buildings area. And the way it intersects with environmental justice and climate action, because we're taking a global problem and literally to our doorstep. We're talking about homes as well as the places we work, the places that we take our kids for school, at daycare, or any of the places that we gather. And the way that this intersects with the climate crisis is in a couple of ways. First is that those places are our first line of defense when it comes to climate harms like extreme heat and wildfire smoke. Many of us are inside quite a bit of the day, and we need our buildings to be better to protect us from those harms. But they're also a huge source of climate pollution. Second in Oregon, just behind transportation. I think it was the last time I saw it was like 34% of our emissions come from power in our buildings, most of that from burning methane gas. And so those things are making the climate crisis worse. And then, of course, we saw a huge swell in news coverage. A lot of awareness is building rapidly for the unhealthy air inside from using especially methane gas, natural gas, quote unquote, inside our homes for heating, cooking, and hot water, as well as the rapid rise of the cost of fossil fuels, whether it's heating oil or again, gas. We've seen those spike. But on the good side, the solution side, the stuff that we're going to be working on in the legislature and elsewhere, we have the technology and the techniques today to make our buildings more climate resilient, more energy efficient, and all electric. Those moves will increase affordability, which is such a huge deal. The Oregonians who can least afford high energy bills tend to pay the most. They tend to be in lower performing homes. We are really focused on making sure incentives and repairs and rebates go to those folks first to make sure that we upgrade those homes, lower the cost of energy. We'll protect our health, our family's health from going to more electric appliances, stop burning fossil fuels inside, as well as the more that we tackle climate change, the healthier we will be from those outside forces. And then this is just a great opportunity, especially with a lot of federal money coming in to create a lot of jobs. It's going to be recession proof. It's going to be jobs that can't be exported. And it's all kinds of skills and workers in Oregon. So for all those problems and solutions, we have a few bills that we're keeping our eye out for. The caveat here is we don't have bills yet. What we do expect to see is a result of a task force that ran over the better part of last year. It's called the Resilient Efficient Buildings Task Force. It was legislators and builders and environmental justice representatives and climate groups and utilities and a whole bunch of people studied a bunch of this stuff, got together some ideas from best practices around the country and some modeling that they did to see what would do the best as far as reducing climate pollution and increasing health, lowering bills, all that kind of good stuff. And basically by reading the tea leaves of their final recommendations, and then what we've heard from Senator Kate Lieber and Representative Pam Marsh, who led the task force and are leading on putting the ideas into legislation. This is basically what we're thinking is going to pop out. We should know hopefully pretty soon the actual bills and all the details of what will be in them to start. And then, of course, we begin at our advocacy once we see those. We're looking at a holistic approach, kind of split into new buildings, existing buildings. On your new building side, built smart from the start is what we're talking about. And that has to do with basically building codes. Those are the rules by which construction architects and everybody follow, primarily for safety, but also can be for energy efficiency. We're looking at just updating the code for every building in Oregon. If it's new, it needs to follow these codes, and those codes can be stronger. to increase energy efficiency, decrease pollution. And then one interesting idea that bubbled up during the task force that we're told is being explored is something called embodied carbon, which is like a little nerdy way to say the carbon footprint of building materials like cement, steel, wood, like how much greenhouse gases get released when those things are made. Can we measure that, and can we reward those building materials that have a less of a footprint? So that's kind of your new building side. In your existing buildings, we're shorthanding them, calling it healthy heating and cooling for all. This is where regular folks will probably see the most direct effect from these bills. That's all the incentives, from getting electric heat pumps, from getting new windows, doors, insulation, air purification systems. So homes and businesses looking for those things. A ton of that is related to the federal money that's coming in from the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as state programs. And then one thing we want to see, hopefully we'll see in here, something that was talked about was increasing customer choice. We know that people prefer electric for heating and cooling and hot water and cooking if all things are equal. They prefer to be incentivized for electric, and as well as kind of taking those really great energy efficiency programs that Oregon has had for a long time. A lot of people worked really hard for many years to get us to a good place as a state, but those programs are kind of narrow right now, and we're looking to have them kind of encompass climate pollution and hitting our climate targets. So that's a little bit of there was a lot thrown out there in that that bill idea in the task force, and so we'll see what ends up shaking out there. Next one's called a building performance standard. That simply means for large buildings, which are the biggest sources of pollution, they would be required over time to clean up their operations, make a shift to lower pollution, and become more efficient and thus more climate resilient. That's a really exciting one because, again, that's one of our biggest sources from the homes and building space of climate pollution. And that can be lowered by just looking at those large buildings. And then the last one is a lead by example bill, where we'll see some sort of move for public buildings owned by the state, financed by the state, etc., to show what can be done as far as climate resilience, energy efficiency, and moving toward electric power. So those are sort of the major bills that we're looking at. Again, waiting for the actual language to drop, and then we'll have bill numbers and all that stuff. But what it comes down to, I think, for advocates is these very simple things. We can accomplish all of them with this holistic approach to buildings by increasing efficiency and resilience, and also by making a transition to all electric clean buildings, better health, lower costs, less pollution, safer communities. The one thing we're saying this session, if you remember nothing else, Oregonians deserve healthy, affordable, resilient homes and buildings that run on clean energy. We did not, unfortunately, get the bill that I was looking for introduced, where each one of us would get our own wrench and go into climate denying politicians' homes and take their gas stoves from their cold dead hands. That's what I wanted. Nobody bid on that one, but maybe next session. I think, looking at the many faces here, you're all seasoned, many of you, but this is just a quick list of things. Primarily, we want to talk to legislators, talk to your legislator and say, hey, I've heard about the homes and buildings. I know that we can really improve them. It will have a lot of benefits. Is this a top priority for you? It's a top priority for me. Let's get this done this year. We are so new. We don't have a website, but if you're interested in a little bit of getting involved, you can email organizers at buildingresilience.org. That will go to our organizing team, and we'll get you set up. Our website's coming, all that kind of good stuff. So we'll be keeping folks in the loop. Families for Climate will be in the coalition, getting the information, passing it out, as well as any other groups who join the coalition. So plenty of information sharing ahead. Very excited to be working with all of you, and happy to answer any questions.
I'm going to just read a question from the chat from Leonard, who is wondering if the will build smart from the start include the substance of last year's REACH code bill, or is that dead for now?
Good question. The REACH code bill is sort of okay, got us going on this, but they all involve building codes. But what we're doing instead of the REACH code, which would have allowed cities to be more efficient if they had chosen, we're actually just raising the entire base code. So it's still one code across the state, which a lot of builders actually like a lot. But we're just taking that up a notch, because what we've learned from the builders and architects and engineers and everybody who was involved in the task force and who we've talked to as building resilience, it's totally doable. So many of them are already doing it. They're building what they call above code. It's affordable, which is so important because we need to build so much housing, so many more schools and businesses. We know that, and this is just a great time to be raising that code so that we are prepared for the future of hotter, smokier, and also making sure we're not making it worse.
Mm-hmm. Brad, I see 4 hands raised, and I also two more questions in the chat, and so I'm going to go to Linda first. Linda, go ahead.
So Brad, do you know yet whether there's any kind of workforce provisions in the bills? That's sort of question number 1. And number 2 is the Energy Trust of Oregon mandate going to be addressed in the bills?
As far as workforce, I know that is something they're talking about. Organized labor as well as community groups were part of the task force, and so that was a big point of priority. I don't know what that looks like yet. Until we see the bills, we won't. But lots of people are talking about it. And as far as the Energy Trust mandate, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
Oh, you're muted, Linda. There
It would be a mandate that would require them to encourage greenhouse gas reduction in addition to energy efficiency.
Yeah, so that was something that was again discussed during task force. It was part of the final recommendations, but without seeing the bill, we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. It's something that we certainly hope will be in there, though. I think it just makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Ryan Phillips has a hand raised.
Hi, Brad. Thanks for the presentation. So we've heard about transportation. We've heard about building, and I'm wondering about laws that we see or anticipating that come out of the nexus of those two. So we know from Tina Kotek's executive orders really pushing for additional housing. We've seen similar statements by both caucuses in the legislature. And one concern that I have that I know is shared by other folks who work in public and active transportation is whether or not those concerns will integrate access to public transit and active transportation in either the funding or the kind of other requirements or authorizations. And I'm just wondering about kind of what any work's being done on that, or kind of what you're hearing about any work that's being done with respect to or thinking about how to connecting that transportation and housing nexus.
That is a great question. I know there's a ton of really forward-thinking architects and community development organizations that are looking at that stuff. The bills that we are focused on as building resilience really have to do with the physical structures more than placement and community around them. So this is very much like kind of from the walls in sort of reforms. And so I'm not an expert, unfortunately, on sort of that nexus, but I certainly hope, I know, it's all part and parcel to the solutions.
Let's see, Eric has his hand raised, and I see you also put something in the chat, but go ahead,
Oh,
Eric.
yeah, that was it. That was about Steve's
Oh,
question
okay.
there. Thanks. Yeah, I wonder if if these bills, how they address rental property upgrades, and also like the residential infill type ADU and whatnot. Like, is there going to be an incentive to get that sort of long tail of like homeowners and the building affordability with the efficiency at the same time? Thanks.
I think if I understood your question, it's kind of like how is the building resilience body or suite of bills going to continue to encourage affordable housing development and things like that?
Yeah, and also to get into the rental, like the
Right.
unupgraded furnace, where you can replace a part for year after year and write it off all the time on the least efficient furnace, and it's leaking, poisoning people and whatnot. But putting in a heat pump, you don't get any kind of incentive as a landlord from that. So how do we get and also maybe leverage to the renters to be able to initiate that upgrade or something? Thanks.
That's a great question. Yeah. So yeah, for renters, it's true. They don't get to choose their appliances most times. And so it's sort of an open question. We'll see how the legislators approach it. There's been some pretty interesting work done as far as incentivizing that, and it's whether we have a building performance standard for large multifamilies, and whether the incentives are tied to that. So we have to see a little bit more about how it shakes out. I will tell you, as a coalition, one of our most or our highest priorities is to make sure that this benefits renters, but also does not harm renters. We can't have any of these costs passed on. We can't lead to more displacement. And so definitely on top of mind, but unfortunately without the bill language, we're not quite sure yet.
Thanks, Eric. We have time for one more question now, and then we have to move on to our other presenters. But if you have more questions for Brad, there'll be more time at the end. Bill, you had a hand raised.
Brad, does the new statewide building code intended include renovations as well as new structure?
I cannot say for sure, but my understanding of building codes is that if a renovation is like a certain threshold of like, I don't know exactly how they measure it, whether it's like total cost or certain percentage of the building change, that then building codes apply. Happy to ask our more expert people to find out a solid answer on that.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Brad.
Oh, and I just want to read quickly from the chat, Leonard, before you move on, that Ryan shared that the Oregon Department of Energy has several heat pump programs that incentivize landlords to install and use them. So thanks for sharing that, Ryan.
Very good. Next up, we have Rory Cowal and Deb Lev of Divest, Oregon. Thanks for being here and sharing.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Families for Climate for inviting Divest Oregon to share our bill. HB 2601, the Treasury Investment and Climate Protection Act. My name is Rory, and I'm a volunteer with the Divest Oregon Coalition. The Divest Oregon campaign is a grassroots campaign, and everyone involved is a volunteer like me and Deb. The Treasury Investment and Climate Protection Act offers a responsible path to ensure the future financial performance of PERS, and a livable climate for Oregon by ending investments in fossil fuels. The bill is supported by Divest Oregon's 98 statewide member organizations. Those organizations include all of Oregon's teachers' unions, representing 66,000 PERS beneficiaries. Also included in our coalition are racial justice groups, faith communities, and adult and youth climate activists. The chief sponsors for the bill are Reps Pham, Gamba, and Dexter, Senator Golden, and a growing number of co-sponsors. First, I will offer some background on Oregon Treasury investments. The Oregon State Treasury invests $128 billion. The Public Employee Retirement System, also called PERS, constitutes $90 billion. PERS is a big pension fund, the 12th largest in the US, because all Oregon public workers' retirement money is in the same fund. Oregon's money is managed by Treasurer Reed and staff. The Oregon Investment Council sets policies for Treasury investments, and our bill, HB 2601, concerns the Treasury's investments in fossil fuels. We know that at least $5.3 billion of PERS is invested in fossil fuel companies. We also know the Treasury continues to enter into new long-term fossil fuel investments. However, we don't know the full extent of the Treasury's fossil fuel investments because the Treasury has an unfortunate transparency problem. 40% of PERS is publicly traded on open stock markets, and the Treasury has released data regarding these investments only once, after pressure from Divest Oregon in 2021. Another 60% of PERS is invested in private funds, and the public, including PERS beneficiaries, does not know what's in those private investments. So why do we need the Treasury Investment and Climate Protection Act? Climate change is intensifying in our state. Last year, Oregonians experienced record-shattering fires and deadly heat, and to avert future catastrophes, we must confront the primary culprit behind climate change, fossil fuels. The fossil fuel industry is funded by investors, so by investing in fossil fuels, the Treasury is doing its part to bankroll the climate crisis. It is time for Oregon to stop investing in oil, gas, and coal. And wise investors are already doing this. The world is rapidly moving toward clean energy, and while this global transition is great for the planet, it's a serious problem for the fossil fuel industry. The more we rely on clean energy, the more worthless fossil fuels will become. Investors can protect their future earnings by selling investments in fossil fuels and reinvesting that money into something better. For both investors and the planet, this process is win-win. It's a wise financial decision, and it cuts off funding to an industry that is harming the earth. New York State, New York City, and Maine have all implemented investment strategies which minimize or eliminate fossil fuel investments, and Oregon should be next. The truth is, we have to act quickly. If the Treasury doesn't do enough to address the financial risk posed by climate change, the consequences could be dire. In 2021, the Treasury commissioned a climate risk assessment. The outside consultants who conducted the assessment warned of reduced investment returns and recommended urgent action. Divest Oregon's requests for the Treasury to release the report revealed yet again the Treasury's transparency problem. Only after sustained pressure from our coalition did the Treasury finally release a highly censored version of the report. HB 2601 mandates the following solutions. 1, an immediate moratorium on new carbon-intensive investments. The first step is for the Treasury to stop digging the hole deeper by continuing to invest in fossil fuels. 2, exit from investments on the Carbon Underground 200, a list of the top 100 coal and top 100 oil and gas reserve owners in the world. And this can be done within the first 6 months. 3, exit from more comprehensive lists of fossil fuel investments. I'd like to point out that the second and third components affect the Treasury's publicly traded funds. Component 4 concerns private funds. Exit from existing carbon-intensive private investments by 2035. And the longer timeline here recognizes that the Treasury's private investments involve long-term contracts. 5, establish a portfolio-wide climate resilience plan. The Treasury's own experts say a plan is urgently needed, and that plan must consider climate's impact on Oregon's most vulnerable residents. Finally, 6, require transparency in reporting. This is the only way to know if the Treasury is accomplishing the mandate. I'd like to conclude with some key takeaways, as well as ways that you can get involved. HB 2601 protects PERS by requiring the Treasury to invest in equal or better investments using its expertise and within fiduciary duty. The question is not if climate risk requires change, but how and when fossil fuel investments are phased out. The risk is clear. Now we need urgent action. Transparency and accountability are needed, especially for the 60% of PERS that is in private investments. Oregon can be a leader in confronting the climate crisis and the financial risk of continuing to invest in fossil fuels. You can help us. We need you. We need your help. We need you to sign up to meet with your legislators, along with fellow constituents, to let them know why you're supporting HB 2601. The meetings are mostly over Zoom, and we'll attend the meeting with you, so you just need to sign up and show up. You can also help by joining our coalition to receive updates and other ways to take action. I love being part of a coalition because there's so much to do, and we would love to have you join. So we'll share links to do both of those things in the chat and also in notes that will be shared after the meeting. Thank you very much. We're available to take questions.
Well, I'll just say I'm a PERS member, and I think it's outrageous that a public employee retirement system is invested in private equity that I can't see what it is. So I'm really grateful for this work that you guys are spearheading. Philip, go ahead.
Is there any way of knowing whether the Treasury isn't actually following the recommendations that it got from that report he was referring to? I mean, it sounds like we don't have any way of knowing whether they are because they're not being transparent.
That's a really great question. There's been no indication up until recently that anything is being done about the climate risk. Now, some people might say, well, I saw a press release recently that the treasurer said climate risk is something that we need to address. And what he has announced so far is making a plan that he'll reveal in 2024. And at that time, he'll share it with the Oregon Investment Council. And it's really, his timeline here isn't urgent enough. So first of all, there's no guarantee that the Oregon Investment Council will agree to his plan. His term is up in 2024, so we don't know if the next treasurer will agree. And then finally, if everyone agrees, he's talked about a vague goal of net zero by 2050. And as many of us know, net zero is a tricky term, often quite vague, and 2050 is just too far from now. Another major difference I'd like to point out, between what it appears the Treasury would like to do and what our bill mandates is we haven't heard from Treasury any indication that they'll stop investing in fossil fuels. So to us, to admit that fossil fuels are a problem and climate risk has to be addressed, it seems ridiculous to then continue investing in fossil fuels and starting new long-term contracts with fossil fuel companies.
Yeah, a very quick comment. If the rest of this group is successful in what it's trying to do, and that happens all around the country, these investments will be heading toward worthlessness. So simply from a financial point of view, not dealing with it is a really bad idea.
Absolutely. That's big part of the message.
Thank you so much. I just want to point out, thanks, Alan, for dropping in the chat that the OIC, the Oregon Investment Council, is meeting tomorrow, and I believe they're taking testimony. So if that's something you have the time and motivation to do, I encourage you to consider it. Okay, Leonard, do you want to introduce our final speaker of the night, since I imagine everyone's ready?
Yep. Closing us out is Nora Apter, who kicked us off. Thanks everybody for hanging in. Nora, thanks for sharing some bills to round us out here.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you all see my screen? Okay. I recognize we're getting late in the evening, maybe for some folks, so I will do my best to be concise, and that should hopefully not be too hard because we already had so many great presentations on a number of bills that are a priority for OEC this session. So again, I'm Nora Apter. I'm the Climate Program Director for the Oregon Environmental Council. For those who don't know OEC, we're a multi-issue environmental policy advocacy organization. We've been around for over 50 years, working to advance innovative and equitable solutions to Oregon's environmental challenges. And through effective lobbying and dedicated grassroots engagement from people like you all who have been so incredible in helping to advance progress on climate, we've made a ton of, we've had a ton of success in recent years in adopting new policies in Oregon to cut climate pollution and protect people on the front lines of climate impacts. But we've heard from other panelists tonight, we know additional action is needed to ensure pollution reductions happen at the pace and scale necessary and to enable an equitable transition to a clean energy future. So as we've heard, there are a lot of exciting opportunities in the 2023 session to both cut climate pollution, advance equity, improve community resilience, and create good paying jobs in Oregon's clean energy economy. So we've heard from Brad around the resilient, efficient buildings policies, heard from Chris on clean and equitable transportation, Ira around legislation that protects workers from climate-fueled extreme heat and wildfire smoke, as well as from Rory about Divest. Rather than recapping all of those, I'm just going to emphasize strong support. These are top priorities for OEC this session. And instead, I'm going to focus on these two buckets these two final buckets: climate smart land and waters, and strategic investments and thriving communities. So the first policy I'm going to talk about is related to natural climate solutions. So we know that if we're going to avoid climate catastrophe, we have to transform the way we use and manage our land, and we need more programs and investments to get that work done. We know that advancing natural climate solutions is key to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. If that target sounds familiar, that's because that's what the IPCC has concluded is necessary to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So for folks who are unfamiliar, natural climate solutions are activities that protect or enhance the ability of natural and working lands, like our forests and agricultural lands and wetlands, to sequester carbon while maintaining or actually increasing climate resilience, as well as water quality and quantity, public health and biodiversity. So some examples of natural climate solutions are cover crop planting, rotational grazing, coastal community protection, lengthened logging rotations, reforestation, and wetland protection, just a few examples. So we know that these types of practices are, again, really critical to sequestering carbon, helping to achieve our climate goals, but they're also a win-win for landowners or managers in Oregon because they help make our natural resources more resilient to ever worsening drought, wildfires, and extreme temperatures. Have a lot of landowners in Oregon that have been adopting these types of practices over the years that have demonstrated how they benefit their bottom line in terms of resilience to drought, resilience to heat and wildfire smoke. So there's a lot of benefit in terms of adaptation to climate change, as well as being part of a solution. So on the note of a solution, the bill that relates to climate smart land management is SB 530. This is the bill that was introduced by Senator Dembro. It's co-sponsored by the House Climate, Energy, and Environment Committee Chair, Rep. Marsh, as well as the Senate Natural Resources Chair, Senator Golden, and several others as original sponsors. And what this bill will do is position the state to leverage federal funding as well as private investments in those natural climate solutions on our forests and ag lands and wetlands. There's more than $20 billion just in the Inflation Reduction Act for climate smart agricultural land management alone. So that gives you kind of a sense of the type of funding that we're looking to leverage through this legislation and make sure that we're translating it and directing it to landowners in Oregon. So the bill will create a source of state funding for voluntary actions to remove climate pollution and store it in natural and working lands. It will do that in part by funding and directing our state natural resource agencies to provide incentives as well as technical support to forest landowners, farmers, and ranchers to implement those natural climate solutions. It will also invest in a comprehensive Oregon natural and working lands inventory and study opportunities for workforce development and training. All of this will help ensure our forests and waters and farmlands and our natural resource economy is more resilient, again, as I mentioned, to those ever worsening climate impacts. So I will leave it at that for now, just recognizing we are running up on time, but I will drop in the chat a link to an endorsement form, as well as a one-pager on the bill. And then I'm going to just very briefly talk about kind of an overarching opportunity that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So like I said at the intro, we have a huge opportunity this session to leverage recent federal climate action and investments, and specifically the Inflation Reduction Act. We've heard a lot in terms of what this bill could do, potentially reducing emissions 40% by 2030, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs, protecting and improving public health. There's so much opportunity here for Oregon, but securing the full climate and economic potential of this law really hinges on strong state implementation. And we really need to use this session to position Oregon to leverage these federal investments and deliver meaningful results for Oregonians. So the more policies and programs we have in place that drive down climate pollution and ensure a strong and thriving workforce, the more competitive Oregon will be in securing federal grant funding, and the faster we can translate these investments into meaningful on the ground benefits for people across the state. So some of the ways that we can do that this session are to make sure that our state agencies are adequately resourced and staffed to apply for and administer funding. So I mentioned this at the beginning, we're going to need everybody here, all of your friends, to push for a strong strategic state budget that adequately resources and staffs energy, environment, and natural resource agencies. There are also a number of legislative concepts in the mix that will help position Oregon to maximize the potential of these investments. I think certainly when we're thinking about buildings, when we're thinking about transportation, there are direct federal funding ties that to those concepts. I mentioned the opportunity for natural climate solution investments. We do not want to leave dollars on the table. We want to be strategic about how we're directing those funds and prioritizing them for communities that stand to benefit the most from them. There are a few other pieces of legislation that we're expecting to see, including two that Speaker Rayfield's office has been leading on. One is a clean energy technology leadership concept that would complement some of the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act that are focused on domestic clean technology manufacturing. We want to make sure that as we're expanding those industries in the United States, that we're maximizing the opportunity for those industries to come to Oregon and benefit workers and create jobs here. So that means, you know, if we're thinking about things like heat pumps, Oregon has a chance to lead in producing those types of technologies that really the entire world is going to be seeking in the transition to a clean energy economy. There's also a need to ensure that state agencies have clear directives around prioritizing federal investments to maximize climate outcomes, to maximize benefits for communities, and again, support a thriving workforce. Part of that will mean the staffing up of state agencies, but also providing that clear direction and guidance and providing support so that agencies can ensure robust community engagement and transparency around their decision making, and ensuring uniform consideration and prioritization of climate and greenhouse gas emissions as they're making federal funding decisions. So there's going to be a number of concepts related to that. That's why you don't see bill numbers. There are not bills that have been introduced yet on this, but it's going to be really important this session that we help our legislators be proactive, be thoughtful, and strategic. So since there's no bill numbers for that, I'm just going to drop in OEC's action list. This is where we'll be sending updates for bills as they get introduced, as they move. It is a great way to stay informed and show your support for this legislation. So sorry, that was longer than I intended. I really appreciate that everybody is, or many folks are still on, and I'm happy to just drop my email. Oh, sorry, in the chat if we don't have time for Q&A, that's totally fine.
Well, I think that there are people still here. There may very well still be questions. So if anyone has questions for Nora, or also just any outstanding questions for any of our other presenters, please feel free to type those now or raise your hand and ask them. Alan, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yes, I had earlier a question for Chris Smith, and I'll pose that one first, and then I have a quick follow-up. Chris, you were talking about taxation.
You know what, Alan? Sorry, I think Chris had to go. I don't see him.
Oh, I can't ask. Okay, so
I'm actually here. He's on page 2. Yeah, I think it's here.
Still here.
Sorry about that.
Okay, so what I was, I understand the problem that we have in terms of funding for transportation, and I totally get the problem of the historic focus on any funds raised from gas taxes, etc., must go to building new roads, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there is, of course, a real problem, and that is as we transition to electric vehicles, and less gas is purchased, there's going to be a shortage of funds to maintain the roads that we already have. And yes, of course, that's a problem. And so there are efforts, I think, afoot, and you might like to comment on this if you can, to compensate for the loss of gas taxes by doing something that raises funds. And there were a couple of bills that I saw that would seem berserk. They're trying to tax electricity that's used to charge vehicle batteries. How the hell anybody's going to know that? I don't know, but there's a problem there that I think is real that we do have to recognize.
Yeah, and the major approach to solving that is something called the road user charge. And the idea is we would shift from a fuel tax to basically charging you for every mile that you move on the road system. Oregon's had a pilot for that called Origo, essentially a voluntary program where you can sign up and do that instead of paying gas taxes. There's some hints that the legislature will move to implement that first for electric vehicles, since obviously they're not paying fuel taxes. That may make more sense than trying to charge from electricity they're using to charge their batteries. Unclear at what point it becomes politically palatable to do that for all the vehicles. And there are folks who are a lot more expert in the road user charge legislation than I am, but that's sort of the general ODOT strategy behind that.
I have a follow-up, but I'll on a different topic, but I'll let other people ask questions.
Brad, I had a question about the build smart from the start legislative concept, or the guideline or from the task force. And I don't know exactly how much you can say about this, but given the sort of nationwide political polarization around methane gas and the sort of culture wars aspect of gas bans and bans on gas bans, and I can only assume that the task force was having to thread a needle sort of with respect to politics and feasibility in terms of, let me just put it this way. I don't see anybody saying we're going to have a ban on natural gas hookups in new construction, which would seem to me to be the logical climate safe policy to take, but I don't see that coming out as of the task force. So I guess what I'm saying is, what can you say about that, if anything?
That is fair. Yeah, that certainly would be the most simple way to do it. Stop digging the hole deeper, right? We've had a few states successfully do that. Primarily, they've done it through executive power, though. It has not been done legislatively. What we are looking at here is a set of policies. If we take them all together, both the new and the existing, that is going to help guide us on a transition to all electric homes and buildings. Like, that's for sure. And it's because the federal government knows that electrification is the future. And the market knows it too. There's a ton of building that's going on that is all electric. It's actually cheaper to do. It's less of a hassle for builders because they don't have to put any explosive pipelines under their buildings. Cooling is absolute human right in the Northwest. After the last couple of summers, more than 100 people died. And so, like, you can't build anything without cooling morally. Well, hopefully may get that in the building code too. But so heat pumps are more affordable than a furnace and an air conditioner. That also keeps things affordable. So for once, shout out to all of you who have been in the climate movement for decades and for once, the economic stuff is on our side. The wind is at our back. And so what you'll see as a culmination of these policies is a transition off of gas. It just won't be that like swing for the fences, ban it tomorrow kind of thing. I think in a way it's going to be helpful because people are a little tenuous about like change. And so we're going to get to the end of the road at the same time and in this different way, I think. If we can get them all together and make sure that they're really robust.
Thanks so much, Brad. I don't see any other hands except for Alan. So go ahead, Alan.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. I've really enjoyed the presentations and they've been very helpful. What I'm doing on behalf of Southern Oregon Climate Action now is developing some priorities, which we haven't completed yet. But there's one element that hasn't been discussed, and I understand very much the value in focusing on the positive. But there's a whole bunch of bills that have been introduced that absolutely have to be opposed. And some of them, many of them, probably since we have a bunch of really smart people chairing committees, a bunch of them are probably not even going to get a hearing. But there are bills out there that we really need to keep an eye on, because if they actually get any traction, we're going to have to come out gangbusters to oppose them.
Thanks for raising the defensive work as well. It's super important. I think with us 3 minutes over the advertised time, I'm gonna jump in and close it here. Really appreciate a majority of folks sticking around till the end here. And thank you so much to all of our presenters for sharing. And we'll be following up with that summary document in the next few days here. And I'm looking for ways to engage with all of you and do the good work this session. So great to see everybody. Thanks so much for joining us, and look forward to hopefully connecting with all of you more over the next 4 or 5 months. Good night.
Thank you.